right, welcome to Going Deep with Brandon Angelo. You can find him at Angelo Dynasty, right? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, close. At Angelo underscore fantasy, pretty
And
close. A
that's
lot of
great,
dynasty stuff on there though, so that's right on the
right?
button. But
I
yeah,
was
man.
thinking from your site,
Oh yeah, angeloanalysis.com.
Angelo and
So
Al.
there you
See,
go.
okay, so and I'm at the rookie scouting report because that's usually where everyone gets it wrong for me. Is I
For sure, for sure.
or profile, the rookie scouting profile, something like that.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, but Brandon, man, it's so much fun that we're going to be doing this podcast twice a month, and we're knocking one out 2 weeks in a row, and then we'll be back in August after we have a few things to do at the end of the month here. But last week's was definitely a fun conversation. This week we've got more of the same in terms of the level of enjoyment that we got ahead. Looking at maybe players where is the signal versus the noise really good, or guys that maybe we look at and say whether they're young guys or even older players. Is this the beginning of a downturn, perhaps? Are we seeing things that we're wondering about, or is the noise just louder than the signal in some cases?
Right.
So we're gonna just kind of go back and forth. We have some players that we have in mind, and we'll go from there. So, who's someone that just sticks out to you when I say signal versus the noise in either direction?
Oh man, I think the first one is Brandon Aiyuk. I think he had one of the quietest 1,000 yard seasons. He had I think 1,000 yards, 78 catches, 8 touchdowns, and I think it's only gonna go up from here because I think we're gonna see a little bit of a downturn from a guy like George Kittle in terms of role as a pass catcher. I think Ayuk is going to be one of those cats that kind of emerges as potentially a top tier wideout in this league. I think he's had the talent. He's a first round pick at Arizona State. And I think when we watched him at Arizona State, his ability to decelerate really stuck out to me. And I think you can kind of piggyback off that as well if that's your kind of similar sentiments. But for me, I've known him to have the talent, but I think him coming in the last episode we talked about what some issues guys have coming into the NFL, and he had a lot of those, right? He wasn't trusted by the offense. He was kicked out of practice a couple times, right? But from all signs right now are blinking towards him being ready to take on a premier role in one of the league's most exciting offenses. And I think that he can do that. And I think another 1,000 yard plus season is on the horizon for him. And I think we might see 1,200 yards and 10 touchdowns from Brandon Aiyuk. I think he emerges as potentially the premier option on that offense alongside Christian McCaffrey, because I don't think Deebo Samuel's that guy anymore. I think we kind of saw that with Shanahan going out and getting Christian McCaffrey, right? I don't think Deebo Samuel can stay healthy, and I don't think he's going to be consistent enough as a wide receiver to play, X, Z, play in the slot. I think he's going to be used more in a gadget role, but I think Ayuk might be their top target getter at wide receiver, and with that offense and what he can do in the red zone too, I think that's sky's the limit for a guy like that.
I couldn't agree more, and it's funny because I just wrote a piece today at Football Guys in my long-running gut check column about premium players based on ADP, and maybe guys that you could get as alternatives who either might equal or be equal or greater to that production at a lower cost, or guys you find super cheap who combined with players that you take instead of those premium picks at that same range, you
Sure.
probably get a net positive out of that. And I joked that it was kind of like beers in the saying that's like, I picked some beer that I would never drink that people seem to like, some craft beer, and then said, here's some PBR and here's some Miller High Life. And it's like, there's some Miller High Life there that, you spend a little bit on that and have some good comfort food that you cook, the whole experience as a, overall might be more memorable than if you went out to eat, depending on the restaurant you went to. But, kind of like that. And when I was writing about Ayuk, it's so funny. I echoed the same sentiments as you, is that Deebo Samuel, when he came into the league, great runner after the catch, awesome athlete, not a great one-on-one route runner. That ability to beat press man isn't really his forte. And it never was, and it hasn't really gotten significantly better where you'd say, you're that guy that we want to match up against the best corner, and we know you're going to win that route. And
Right.
and he, after they had to use him as a runner a couple of years ago due to injury, he pretty much rebelled against that to the media, saying, "Look, don't put me in that role. I don't want to be in this role long term. Please don't do
Right.
that."
No, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, because he knows what he is. He's a wide receiver and who can do punt return, and occasionally you can get him into space as a runner, and he's great. But he doesn't want to be pounding that ball up between the tackles or getting a high volume of carries. And so you're right. The whole idea of Christian McCaffrey coming in seems to me the team said, "Listen, we need a bell cow here who can also be versatile in space, and that will open up the offense horizontally and vertically for us. And Aiyuk can be that guy who, and listen, if he's survived the Kyle Shanahan, hardship of what happens to young players until they learn his system and play the way he expects, you're golden once that happens."
Yep.
I mean, and so here's the thing. What's funny to me, though, Aiyuk was wide receiver 13 last year in PPR leagues. You look at his ADP right now, he's wide receiver 31. He's 70th off the board. And you're just looking at that, and I'm going, okay, you've got that. And then you've got across the bay one of the best wide receivers who's played the game as a route runner in Davante Adams. But now he's inheriting Garoppolo. They've lost Darren Waller. They've lost they've lost Foster Moreau, who may not sound like a huge player, but he's a helpful guy. They're losing Hunter Renfrow the way that this is going, and they brought in all the Patriots cast-offs to basically run this offense down to Philip Dorsett.
Myers, Dorsett, yeah.
And there's no offensive line that in Las Vegas that matches what Jimmy Garoppolo had in San Francisco.
Right.
So, and you took Derek Carr away, who he came to play with. Like, he literally went there to be near family and to play with his former college teammate, and they ran him off. So you look at that, and I think, do I really want to draft a guy like Davante Adams that high when I can get someone else like A.J. Brown, who's on a more stable offense and may not have the top 5, may not have the top 1 or top 2 ceiling of Adams in a great year, but he's certainly probably top 5 like Adams.
Right.
That's a realistic ceiling. Or Deebo, who finished, yes, he missed multiple games, but he finished outside the top 30 last year, or he was like 28th, and he's being taken way ahead of Aiyuk as if like he's still going to be running the football. So like, to me, like what you're saying makes absolute sense, is that Aiyuk is the guy in this offense in terms of 100%. Being the receiver. I mean, good after the catch. Always been very good as like a slant route runner and play action. It's just a matter of refining the techniques of his game, and part of that too is just understanding what to run versus what defense. Because at Arizona State, as a JUCO transfer, you're probably not getting the complexity of Kyle Shanahan's West Coast scheme.
Definitely not. And he shined as a punt returner there too. And I think that was like, I remember I wrote his initial profile in Angelo analysis when he was right before he was a rookie, and I said I think he's going to be an All-Pro punt returner, and because he was so good in space, and he was great on punt return. But I think his natural ability and inclination to be one of those guys that wins one-on-one matchups, can beat press man, that's all there. So I think they need a guy like that, and I think it's him. It's not Deebo Samuel. I think George Kittle, I think we're going to start to see the downturn of his career, unfortunately. He's such a fun player to watch, but especially as a pass catcher. But yeah, the top 2 in this offense in targets, it's going to be, in my opinion, Aiyuk, and then CMC. They're gonna use him all over the place, especially with a healthy Elijah Mitchell. CMC's gonna be catching a ton of balls too, so it'll be definitely interesting to see what that offense looks like with potentially, I think it's gonna be Brock Purdy at the helm. I don't think it's gonna be Trey Lance. I think that I think that ship is kind of sunk, because I think the idea of Trey Lance is that he can do all of these great things with his feet, but he needs time to develop, and he hasn't. He's been hurt, and I think the Shanahan system is a timing-based system, right? It's West Coast. You have to be on time, on target, know when your guys, where your guy's going to be, when he's going to be there. But that's not Trey Lance, right? Trey Lance is, quote unquote, a freelance type player where he needs off structure, sort of like guy we talked about last time, Kyler Murray, right? He doesn't need structure to be a good quarterback, but that system craves structure.
Yeah, maybe he's more like a technically acceptable Dak Prescott.
Sure.
And he certainly came from a West Coast, but that's the difference between North Dakota State West Coast and Kyle Shanahan West Coast, which is like the difference between a good comic book and a Dostoevsky novel.
Sure. It's it's Harvard versus community college in terms of like the levels of the system.
Yeah,
and I don't think he's I don't know what they're gonna do with him, but I mean I think really the pecking order would be Purdy. I think if they have their choice, Purdy, Darnold backs him up, and then Trey Lance, who you can get for him. He's bye-bye. I mean,
But it's a good point because you brought up Kittle. And I just want to we'll talk about him next, but I want to cap off my thoughts on Aiyuk just from the standpoint of that. In this offense, with Purdy, he was very consistent for a guy who was, just looking at the number of games that he had where he had at least 6 catches and 80 yards. I think he had like 9 games with at least that, which tells you it's not so much the yardage that matters. It's that he's getting open to get targeted.
Right.
And he's making good on those targets well enough that, yes, there was good fantasy production out of that, but the real key there is that the targets were coming his way because he's getting open and he's reliable now.
And consistently. That's huge.
Yeah. So with Kittle, I'm sure there are people who are kind of like raising an eyebrow when we said, yeah, Kittle might be on his way out as a top player, especially when, people are drafting a guy like him in fantasy football, not as high as maybe his, as what his expectation would be, but tight end 4 are still considered a top tight end. It's just the injuries that had dropped him, because if he wasn't injured, he would be 1 and 2 with Kelsey. Right. But he's 54 in ADP overall, at least when you look at, say, football guys, or you look at, certainly we could look at some of the other sites out there, but really, his consensus is around 54 as the pick, and that's, at T4. I think the concern is this, and Adam Harstead brought it up in our show last year, is that tight ends who can do it all are almost a myth in NFL these days.
Right.
I mean, because even when they are in existence, they don't last long and stay healthy long enough. I mean, Rob Gronkowski, who might be one of the best ones ever, had a litany of, had years with injuries that he couldn't complete seasons. It was tough on him. So Kittle's that guy in terms of what he can do overall. But when you start looking at his health history, you have to worry about the rigor of the position and what's asked of him, especially because he is asked to block. He is that kind of player. And you look at, he's had one season where he played an entire year, and that was 2018. And since then, he played 14 games in 2019. 2020 played 8. And then when they went to 17 games, what was it, 2020 or 2021? They went to 17 games. I think it was 2020.
I think it was 2021.
One
was 17. It was the first year at 17 games. So it was 16. It was 16 in 2020. Yep.
Yeah. So he missed 3 games in 2021, and he missed 2 games last year. Again, it's good that he missed a combined, 5 when he actually had missed 8 in 2020. Mm-hmm. But still, it doesn't look great, and the production has continued to kind of, the touchdowns were there, and as the second ranked guy, but you don't really want to lean on touchdowns with receivers and running backs. You want to lean on targets, receptions, and yardage, and those have been they've been below 1,000 yards for the past 3 years.
Right. I mean, yeah, he's a guy. 5 out of his last 7 games were under 30 yards. Under 30 yards receiving. I think he was the reason I think last year he was kind of propped up into that tight end 4. He had 11 touchdowns, right? So he was active in the red zone. But if you're telling me a guy like George Kittle, 5 out of his last 7 games, under 30 yards, what does he do when he's age 30? Yeah. Right? This is age 30 season. Is that going to get better? And if you look at the 2 games out of those last 7 games where he had over 30 yards, it was like 93 yards and 120. So games with big gains attached to that. But those are few and far between now for Kittle because, like I said previously, Aiyuk is the one who's going to be taking those targets, right? Aiyuk's going to be the one moved around, sort of as that movement Z that I think Devontae Smith did such a good job of playing this year too in Philadelphia. But that's going to be a big deal for Aiyuk to play that position and to be the 3-level guy in that offense. And it used to be George Kittle. And that's why he was so sought after the tight end position. He played a 3-level role, which is so rare to see tight ends play in the NFL nowadays. He played it well, but I think, in his age 30 season, I don't think we see him have the impact that he had in the past.
Yeah, and I think that's, when we look at players who were all around options, I mean, Antonio Gates could block. He may not have been the greatest blocker, but they used him, and then you had to block in a Marty Schottenheimer offense, for sure. And you look at Tony Gonzalez, who certainly, maybe was known more as a receiver, but certainly had to do his share of blocking in the offense as he was in Kansas City. And as they got older, they went through a period in their early 30s where their numbers maybe declined a little bit, and then they had a bit of a renaissance towards the end. But I think that renaissance towards the end actually came because I think that their staffs kind of made a choice, and they said, he can't do everything anymore. So let's let him focus on what he's going to do to help us the most. And I think that we'll have to see for Kittle if Kittle can get over the hump with the health issues to a point where at least it's manageable stuff. Mm-hmm. Part of it's going to have to come probably with the team saying we can't use him in the way that we've used him in the past. We're going to have to choose a little bit more.
Well, yeah, and I think in that system, he's such him and Juice are probably the best fullback tight end tandem as blockers in NFL history. I mean, they're incredible in that wide zone scheme. So I think they're gonna, in giving him that, especially with CMC back there now at running back, I think it makes the most sense. And there's always been like the sentiment that, the better your running back is as a pass catcher, that's where the tight end production kind of dwindles. And I think we saw that this year with Kittle, especially when CMC, hit the ground running in San Francisco, is that Kittle's production really fell off. And I don't think that's a total coincidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So who's someone else on your list that you feel like, okay, they stand out when we're talking signal versus noise?
I think one of them, he's the only rookie on my list. It's Jahmyr Gibbs. And reason being is if you look at the history of Dan Campbell, right, came from that, he was associate head coach with Sean Payton. When was that? That was in the prime of that Ingram Kamara era. And I think that's his vision, is having the David Montgomery be Mark Ingram. But you have the pass catching capabilities of Jahmyr Gibbs being Alvin Kamara in that offense, right? I think that's more of the comparison for me, is they're very different types of runners. But utilization-wise, I think that's what Dan Campbell's going with. And I think he saw that with took him in the top 15 for crying out loud. And that's where he's going to be utilized. And I think that's going to be a really valuable spot for him in that offense, is being utilized as that do-it-all player, split out wide, go outside, be in the backfield, just that positionless weapon that Dan Campbell saw with Alvin Kamara in his early years in New Orleans. But I like him a ton there, and I also love what I'm hearing from beat writers and seeing on the practice field is how he's being used. He's being used out wide, in the slot, in the backfield. They're doing pony sets with him and David Montgomery, and it's super cool to see because you invested a top 15 pick in this cat, so you're going to use him. And I love everything about Jahmyr Gibbs as a mover and what he can do in space, but it's going to be his early utilization that's really going to, I think, open some eyes as to what Dan Campbell has in store for this offense, because this is going to be an offense, I think, that is not going to be, about the chunk plays. Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jahmyr Gibbs are going to be guys that can, rip off 6, 7, 8 every time. And with Jameson Williams potentially being back after suspension, it's going to be a little bit harder to cover those two. So I'm really excited about what Gibbs is going to bring to that offense. And, early indications is that he's fitting the bill of what a top 15 pick should look like, which is a really good indication of how excited this Dan Campbell-led Lions team is going to utilize him.
Yeah, I think those are awesome points. And when you think about this offense, they add Laporta, who is also a very good intermediate range player who can work outside on the perimeter like a receiver with certain types of routes that hopefully, if that translates to the NFL, and I think it will, you're going to have, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Gibbs, and Laporta all working where you can spread the offense out horizontally and have different levels of intermediate and short that'll work. Really, while Jared Goff will throw the ball downfield, he's very good in that short intermediate game.
100%.
That was the thing with the air raid and what he did back at Cal, where he was very good. And then you add in somebody like Marvin Jones, who's getting older, and maybe not everything's all there with him like it used to be, where he could be that massive deep threat as well and add that element. And while he probably still can do that to a degree, you're not asking him to be one of the best contested catch players in the league like he was in Detroit in his first round. But he can still run intermediate routes, and he can still play at all three positions. So you're getting you're getting players like that can just help your quarterback do what he does best, and also keep that defense off the field, where you can run with Gibbs and Montgomery. You have the short passing game where you're efficient and you're just bleeding clock and doing it in that fashion a little bit more than just trying to go for that big play, and then you end up with lower percentage situations. And with Gibbs, what he does better than Swift is run the ball between the tackles. I mean, he may not be Bijan Robinson between the tackles, okay, but in terms of what maybe Robinson can become, but he's not deficient at running the ball between the tackles.
Yeah, and people think because of his size he's going to be, he's going to be poor between the tackles, but I think he's very decisive, and I think that's the difference between him and Swift and why they got rid of Swift. Was the injuries. He couldn't stay on the field. I think it's a big one for them. But also the indecision that Swift had as a ball carrier led to a lot of bad down and distances for that Lions offense.
Yeah.
And that's the issue is Jahmyr Gibbs isn't going to lose 3-4 yards on a play.
No.
He might get none or one or get stalled, but there were times where Swift would lose 3-4, put you down in the 2nd and 14.
Yeah.
Right? 2nd and 13. And that's the issue is a guy like that whose internal clock never shifted to what the NFL needs. Jahmyr Gibbs has, and that's one of his shining traits is he has a fantastic between the ears skill set and is a very good timing based rusher, whereas DeAndre Swift needed space to be successful. And when he was coming out of Georgia, you could see that, right? He was very good going left, poor going right, and he was also poor between the tackles, so he couldn't read and redirect efficiently.
Yeah.
we thought that would get better. Didn't. And now he's in a space with Philadelphia where it's going to be a little bit easier, right? You're going to have a guy like Jalen Hurts managing that part of the game that makes it, like, that's why Miles Sanders, I think, became a better rusher when Jalen Hurts took the helm. His decisions are much easier.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big deal with DeAndre Swift and, in a Jared Goff-led offense. You have to be the one to make the decisions, not your quarterback, and you have to make the second level reads. But in Philadelphia, it's going to be a little bit easier for a guy like DeAndre Swift. So I think, the Goff-Swift marriage and that offense didn't work out, but I think DeAndre Swift is going to see a bit different matchups at the second level with a guy like Jalen Hurts taking some pressure away.
Those are some great points. And, Swift at the end of the day, he, it's like you talk about people turning lemons into lemonade. And I think Gibbs is a guy who turns lemons into lemonade. Or at the worst, he doesn't turn lemonade into lemons. And I think Swift sometimes turned lemonade into lemons.
Yeah.
So that's kind of part of the issue with that. For me, I think the rookie that stands out to me, and I'm just kind of all in on this guy this year. If there's a absolute wild prediction like that I could see happening, and it's not that when I say all in, I'm not like betting, I'm not going crazy like betting the house on this. But if someone were to say make the wildest prediction that you think that could come true, it would be Dalton Kincaid is an 1,100-yard, 10-touchdown player out of the gate with the Buffalo Bills as a receiver / tight end in a Kelsey-esque type of role, even if it's not exactly schematically like Kelsey, just more in the fact that he's slot outside guy, and they already have their tight end in Dawson Knox, who's a good all-around tight end. And that will happen to me if this Diggs situation doesn't get addressed.
Oh, for sure. He's going to be, if it doesn't get, I think it does, but you're right. I think either way, I think we're going to look back at this July 12th of 2024 and say, holy cow, Dalton Kincaid had a hell of a rookie season.
Yeah, because it's like, if Diggs gets back, and I think it will, because all this is just BS anger talk, and it'll get wrapped up. But if it does, I'm still looking at this offense, and I think Dalton Kincaid, he could still be a 600 to 800 yard receiver this year
100%.
With 6 to 8 touchdowns, and you're still looking at a top 5 tight end with those numbers. You're still looking at someone who's probably in that range.
Right.
And in camp right now, what I keep reading, Brandon, that just interests me about him is, at first, before they were talking about him, other than physically, they're like, oh yeah, physically he looks like he's really good. Like, this guy could be really good. Then you start hearing the coaches kind of say, well, we're not sure what his role is going to be just yet. Then you start reading Dalton Kincaid looks every bit as advertised as the player that the Bills said we're picking him or we're trading down if we don't get him, and that he could be everything they're looking for, and that there's a rapport with him and Josh Allen already. So what I read between the lines with that is that when they drafted him, they thought exactly the way we're talking. You're going to move him around. He's going to become one of the two centerpieces of your passing offense. He's going to be the other mismatch maker that Diggs offers, who can match up one-on-one with certain types of personnel and win on a regular basis. That forces some really difficult coverage decisions for the opposing defense. And he's good after the catch. He can be a red zone threat with his ability to win after the win at the point of the catch at the in contested situations. So when you look at all that, I think what they were saying was we don't want to tell people that's what we're going to do with him, and then it not really work out because he's young and we've jumped the gun. Because we already kind of saw that with James Cook last year, where we didn't go nuts talking about him, but we kind of outlined what we envisioned from him, and he really wasn't that huge of a factor um, at, early on as what maybe they were hoping. And I think they learned a little something from that. But now I think what's happening is that he's playing so well in camp right now, and he's probably learned things fast enough and flashing enough that now they're a little bit more hopeful. And I think we're going to see it show up in August and carry over into the season.
Yeah, no, man, I think you're right, because if you look at, when Josh Allen was at his most successful, he had Cole Beasley as the two-way go guy, right? He had the guy who could beat man coverage in the slot, and this is going to be the guy who can sit in his zone. And he didn't have that guy last year, right? He needs that guy, and that's what Dalton Kincaid can be and more, because of his above the rim capabilities and because of how good he is deceptively from in that fashion after the catch. He needs that. Robin to Diggs's Batman. And I think that is what he can be in that offense, especially because, we're seeing all this kind of, smoke about DeAndre Hopkins, right?
Yeah.
They're like, we don't want to pay him.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Right? Like
Right.
If Josh Allen did not feel comfortable with the room they have, he's at a point in his career where he can say, you know what, go get me DeAndre. And they'd be like, okay, we'll oblige by that, or get something similar done. But I think they feel comfortable with Dalton Kincaid as the second option in that offense right now, because that's what he is. It's not going to be Gabe Davis. I think Khalil Shakir is a great tertiary option, similar to KJ Osborne in Minnesota.
Yes.
But he's not going to be the Robin.
Yeah.
Right?
Not now, at least.
No, 100%. And I think that's going to be Kincaid. And what Kincaid's going to bring to the table is a significant red zone presence that was missing last year, right?
Yeah.
Gabe Davis wasn't that guy. Isaiah McKenzie was miscast. Khalil Shakir wasn't ready. And you just have this whole giant workload on Stephon Diggs and him getting frustrated and throwing his helmet on the sidelines because he's being doubled and tripled in the red zone.
Yeah. And Dawson Knox's brother died last year after a huge season, and he was playing through a lot of emotional stuff.
Yeah, so you're exactly right too, and I totally forgot about Knox in that equation. He's a nice player, but it's like he isn't going to be the guy in the red zone.
No.
And I think both those guys might be on the field at the same time too, which would be kind of fun to watch. But I think you have that guy who can win in the intermediate areas of the field, win and sit in zones and give you a ton of production in the red zone. I think 1,100. If Stephon Diggs doesn't play, man, wheels up. But I think either way, you're looking at a 600, 700 plus yard season from Dalton Kincaid, and if he scores 10 touchdowns, doesn't surprise me 100%.
Yeah. So before we get to your other wide receiver, who I'm just trying to mourn the thought of as I know where you're going, let's go a little further east in New York and talk about Darren Waller as a Giant, because that's the guy you mentioned as well on your list when we were talking about this off air. So what are your thoughts on Waller now that he is in Rutherford?
Yeah, so here goes this. I think he's going to be the target leader in that offense. And I think that's going to be enough with an ascending Daniel Jones. I think Darren Waller is going to get to play more receiver than he ever has. And I think that's a really important thing. He's much more a receiver than he is tight end, right? I think he's going to be, I'd go as far as saying, I think he's going to be what we picture Kyle Pitts of being.
Yes.
And I think that's going to happen this year if he stays healthy, right? He's a bit older now. He's dealt with some injuries in the past 2 seasons, but I think he can be an 1,000+ yard guy because they need him to. I don't think there's really no one else there that screams to you, okay, this is going to be your 1K receiver, right? Yeah. In an offense that wants to pass the ball more.
And they already have a good blocker at tight end in the young kid.
Yeah,
the
Bellinger.
Bellinger.
Yeah, and so I think we're going to see a decent amount of 12 personnel. And I think Saquon Barkley is going to be a big part of that offense. But I also think that the target leader is going to be Darren Waller. And I think that's a really big deal when we're talking about the landscape of the tight end position of how many tight ends in the NFL are going to be their team's target leaders this year.
Yeah.
One definitively in Travis Kelce. And that's really it. I think the rest of them, it's like maybe, but I think it's going to be Darren Waller's going to be that second guy, and that's a big deal in an offense that's probably going to feature him as a receiver.
Yeah. And, it's funny because really Darren Waller, to me, is a more refined version of Kenny Galladay.
Yeah,
Really,
100%.
So you're really just replacing what you hoped you were going to get from Galladay with a player like Waller.
Right.
The hope, the only issue is, can he stay healthy from the being banged up as he was? But everything you're talking about, I mean, you give Daniel Jones a big target. You give the offense an opportunity to run a little more 12 personnel if they want to, and then work out of that to get the mismatches they want, where Waller's going to be detached from the formation as need be. Because Wan'Dale Robinson ain't doing it for you that way.
Nope.
He's a slot gadget guy. Shepard's a slot flanker at best. If you're going to be generous to old version of Sterling Shepard, I don't know about this version of him as he gets as he ages.
Yeah, off another injury too. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, Slayton's kind of a nice reserve who
Yeah,
can
not
contribute off
nice
the bench.
third level threat. I mean, that's
Yeah.
really what he offers you. So I mean, yeah, I mean, really, I mean, it's going to
Hodgins?
be, yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's what you got right now. I mean, the target leaders 1, 2, 3. I mean,
Who takes
Waller, Hodgins, Barkley. Like, what do you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Waller's the only guy who takes the top off the defense on a consistent basis.
Right. He's the only one where you have to really sit and worry about. Like when you're, doing your weekly game plan, the defensive coordinator is circling Darren Waller.
Yeah.
He ain't circling Darius Slayton.
Yeah. So it's that's the fascinating part. So my only question for you then would be, how easy is it going to be for opposing defenses to do what teams were doing to Diggs last year a little bit? But when I say that, we can look at Diggs' production and go, well, did that really hurt you as a fantasy player? No.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think at the tight end position, I think it's going to be interesting to see how they use Waller in the slot. I think that's going to be where he gets his easier production because he's, 6'6", 250, still runs like a deer. But if he's going to be the guy in that offense, he's going to have to play multiple positions. And that's going to be something that's going to be fun to watch if he does, because you're right, he can detach from the formation. And you can't have Bellinger on the field at the same time as him. So, but I think he's going to have to be in order to have the most success with Darren Waller, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is going to be really interesting to see, and that's going to be really on paper, it's kind of an easy offense to slow down.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the issue is, if he's the guy, that's great. If he's a 9-target guy a game, that's great for fantasy, right? Because he's at least going to, etch into that top 3 tight ends, but is it going to be consistent production, or are they going to bring somebody in? I don't think they will, but I mean, it's going to be a lot of Darren Waller and Saquon Barkley, I think.
Yeah, and with tight ends, I mean, again, because he's listed as a tight end, 50 to 60 yards a game with the occasional outburst above 80 is T.J. Hawkinson territory, and that's what T.J. Hawkinson was a top 5 tight end last year. So with those kind of numbers, with a lot of, and also with some games that were below 50, I mean, some 30-yard gains in that. So yeah, that's certainly possible. So I'm going to keep delaying this guy we're going to talk about because we've got.
Oh boy!
But let's go to let's go to where Baltimore came from and go back to Cleveland here a little bit, and I give a little bit of a teaser of that player. And last week we talked a little bit about David Bell being a possible kind of a sleeper type of player who, needs to take that next step and possibly can. And they talked him up a little bit, but the guy who's getting all the targets, getting targeted heavily in OTAs right now, is a guy who just escaped New York and Elijah Moore. So, what were your thoughts? I want to know what your thoughts were of Moore coming out of school, whether you think he's capable of being more than a slot receiver, and if he isn't, is Can he be enough in the slot to be one of those high volume guys like an
Sure.
Edelman or a
Yeah,
Renfro a couple years ago, or any of the Patriots-esque or
yeah,
old Indianapolis Colts wide receivers of yesteryear with under
for
Peyton
sure.
Manning.
Yeah, I think, for me, really, he reminded me a bit of Sterling Shepard, like healthy Sterling Shepard. And that's a good thing. I think he can be the guy in the slot to take some pressure off of your primary receiver, right? Is he going to be the guy in the offense? No, but you don't need him to be, right? He
Yeah,
is perfectly suited as a secondary weapon in an offense. And I think in Cleveland, you're going to see him play that role, right? You have Amari Cooper. I think David Bell can be a nice tertiary piece someday. I don't think it's gonna be this year, but
yeah,
someday. But I think Elijah Moore and the change of scenery is gonna be very good for him. I think it's gonna be a place where he can play in the slot, play with the two-way go, and be a timing based option for Deshaun Watson, especially on important down and distances. So I think that's the role he'll play. I think the thing that we talked about last time is the maturation part of playing in the NFL, right? Is that going to change in Cleveland when things don't necessarily get easier,
yeah,
right? You're you're playing with kind of an offense that underperformed last year. Your head coach might be on the hot seat. This is going to be a really interesting year for Deshaun Watson, the rest of that Cleveland Browns offense. But also, too, you have to understand that this is an offense that is very much revolves around Nick Chubb and his success. He's in my opinion the best pure runner in the NFL right now, and their success is going to come and go with him. Is that going to be a good fit for Elijah Moore? Because there might be some games where he gets 2 targets, right?
yeah,
He might see some 1 for 13s in the stat column. And last year when that was happening with Zach Wilson and the QB carousel of the New York Jets, he wasn't very happy.
yeah.
So I think the talent is there for him to be that secondary option in the NFL offense and to be a good fit for the Cleveland Browns. But is the emotional maturity part of that going to kind of take shape? And is that going to be something where, going into his 3rd year now in the NFL, is that going to be something that comes about? He's going to kind of break through and be the guy that we thought he'd be.
Yeah, because there are a lot of people that thought of him as like a Steve Smith type of player, and
Sure.
and um, you know, I'm sure you probably agree with me in the sense that there was only really one Steve Smith.
Nah, dude was an
Yeah,
absolute
yeah,
enigma.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
so it's like but at the same time, yeah, can he be maybe for fantasy a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 in your lineup, a really good wide receiver 4 who can give you wide receiver 3 production maybe? I think that's where realistically you're looking for with him. So the noise may sound really good in OTAs. He's getting a ton of targets. But let's remember that, yeah, like when you said running the ball with Chubb, that means they want bigger personnel probably in there a little more often. And that offense was kind of geared towards that. So at worst, it may not be David Njoku as your blocker. It might be David Bell who
Yep.
you'd put in
Yep, he
there
fit. He
because
fits
could
better in
block.
12 too, right? I
Yeah,
mean, that's the thing.
yeah. So when you add that in, having a smaller guy like Moore out there seems to me like he's going to be in certain packages. But if the team is playing really good offense or playing really well and they're ahead, um, are you really going to see? Or are there certain matchups the way defenses are playing them? They
Right.
may just say, "Look, we're going to roll bigger." And
And really, I mean, their best lineup right now is Peoples-Jones, Cooper, Bryant, Njoku,
yep, agreed.
Chubb. That's it.
Yeah,
And that's their best lineup. And that's going to be the frustrating thing is Elijah Moore is going to be exclusively an 11 personnel player.
yeah,
They're not going to want to play a lot of 11 this year.
yeah,
They're just not, because that's not their best grouping.
yeah.
And that's going to be the frustrating part is even if Peoples-Jones, let's say, goes down with injury, David Bell's going to be the next one in 12.
Or Cedric Tillman.
Or Cedric Tillman, right? And so that's the thing is, he's going to be reliant on them being in some longer down distances, third downs, because I don't think, with how good Nick Chubb still is, that Elijah Moore is going to be a 110-plus target guy. I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, and with the offensive line as good as it is, if Chubb gets hurt, Jerome Ford, you need to know. And and they might say, you know what, we could bring Elliott and do well with that, or we could bring Hunt back, and we could do well with him in that offense if we needed to go there, or we could get Dalvin Cook if he's still hanging around if the injury happens early enough, and we could still really roll. But otherwise, I think they're happy to roll with Ford and let him do that, and he might get enough touches to give you a low-end Kareem Hunt type of thing. But moving on, let's move on to Baltimore now. The old ones. Cleveland Browns, and talk about their receiving core, because I think we're kind of one up and one down, and the one up is the Elijah Moore sized player in Zay Jones. But does that mean the one down is, just tell it to me straight, is it really Rashad Bateman?
Oh man, I think so. The tough thing is with Zay Flowers. Both Zay Jones and Zay Flowers are quite good.
Did I say Zay Jones?
Yeah, but I like me some Zay Jones.
That's hilarious. Okay.
No, it's okay. But no, I think Zay. It's really here's the issue here. You have 3 receivers in that offense, who none of them are better than Mark Andrews.
That's
the only one that could be better than Mark Andrews currently is Zay Flowers. I do not think Rashad Bateman is ever going to pan out to what I want him to be, or anyone. The reason being is you signal something when you draft Zay Flowers in round 1. You go out and get Odell Beckham Jr. So what does that tell you about Rashad Bateman's role in that offense? It's going to diminish. And I think Zay Flowers is going to be the guy they wanted in that offense, right? This is going to be more of a spread them out, I think. And this is also going to be an offense where they're going to move one guy around consistently. If you look historically about how Rashad Bateman's utilization looks, he's going to be more so on the outside, running more intermediate. That's going to be him. He's not going to be the guy who's going to be moved around, and he's not going to be the chess piece. That's what they drafted Zay Flowers for. And I think it's going to be Zay Flowers arrow up, Bateman arrow down, because I think Flowers is the one, they want to give the chance of being the guy in that offense. I think, running, 11 in that offense would be really interesting, because, Andrew's always going to be on the field. So is Andrews going to be in the slot? Or is Bateman going to be in the slot? Or is Zay Flowers going to be in the slot? Because I think we know at this point Beckham's going to work out wide. That's fine. But do they trust Bateman enough to stay on the field and be a bigger play threat? Because that's one thing they lack too, right? Is big plays. That's not who Rashad Bateman is. That's not who Odell Beckham Jr. is anymore, in my opinion. That's why they drafted Zay Flowers. So that's going to be an interesting piece of it.
Do you think it's Bateman's not it because of his inability to stay healthy over the past few years? Or do you think it's more than that? Because when you watch him, say, at Minnesota in the open field, and that one play against Miami, or a couple plays against Miami last year, you could see why people clamored for that as a possibility.
Sure.
But at the same time, is it because maybe he's best at one position, and that one position also includes certain types of routes that maybe Lamar isn't in his wheelhouse? Because when I see as you were talking, I thought to myself, what if Bateman were a Titan or an Atlanta Falcon who played outside, off play action? And I thought maybe he'd be what people thought Corey Davis would become. Maybe,
sure. Yeah.
Or he could be a Roddy White-esque type of player in terms of what White did really well way back in the day. Maybe that ages me a good bit, but like,
No,
the,
for sure.
but the thing is that Bateman, Lamar. When people say, "Oh, Lamar can't throw," they're obviously fantastically mistaken. But it's like Deshaun Watson in the fact that the velocity throws, the high velocity, deep out, deep comeback, were never their things. They're not. That's not. If defenses can say we're going to make you throw that to convert, the defense has won that drive
Sure.
9 times out of 10, or let's say 7 out of 10 to not be hyperbole. But whereas Matt Ryan in his prime, you knew he could make those types of throws, and you were good. Or Josh Allen makes those types of throws, but again, in the middle of the field, Lamar Jackson's deadly. In tight pockets, middle of the field, efficient movement, everything that Kyler Murray wasn't, that we discussed last week, is what really Lamar Jackson is, as a pocket player and a thrower in the middle of the football field. But you're right. Like, you look at Bateman and say, really, why would you put him in the middle of the field when you have two other guys who might be better at that?
Yeah, that's the tough thing. And some of those guys you mentioned too, I think the similarity is you talk about Tennessee. You also talked about Matt Ryan and Roddy White. Timing-based passers,
Yes.
right? Especially outside the numbers. I think when you look at Drew Brees too and Michael Thomas, that's how he was utilized.
Yes.
And I think that's how like guys like Rashad Bateman will make their hay in the NFL, is that those type of utilization ratios, right? That's not going to be what this offense will probably look like, because Mark Andrews is that guy, right? And that's the issue, is he's in that role. And the other important role is going to be that movement Z type player. Zay Flowers fills that one better than Rashad Bateman. So you have kind of this guy cut out in the rain of, what the heck do I do here? Well, he's miscast now. And with the additional surgery he had in the offseason that we're just hearing about, I think he's going to be behind the 8 ball in terms of finding those important targets in this offense. So that's going to be the issue. I think he can still be a very good player. I just don't think he's cast correctly in this offense, and it's kind of sad for me to say because I loved him coming out. But I think a change of scenery for a guy like Rashad, but when he can play that Michael Thomas, that Roddy White type role, that'd be perfect, right? You mentioned Atlanta. That's kind of like what Drake London's doing right now, and I think it's a good fit for London, right? I think New Orleans might need a guy like that now with with Michael Thomas being kind of on the outs of the league.
Sure.
But that's going to be one of those interesting pieces of what's going to happen to Roddy White. He's a guy I don't think his option gets picked up, but if it does after he's done, it'll be interesting to see what that offense looks like.
Or Denver if they get rid of Cortland Sutton.
I think he's a better fit than Cortland Sutton in offense too. I think Sutton's a little bit limited, especially after the ACL. We'll see how he moves this year, but in terms of being the one thing that Michael Thomas was really good at is, as big as he was very abrupt.
Yeah.
Which is why he was so good at selling the slant pattern, right? Rashad Bateman has that to his game. Cortland Sutton does not, at least anymore. So that'll be really interesting to see. But yeah, I think that that short, intermediate target, the safety blanket of an offense, that's who Rashad Bateman is. But what they do in Baltimore right now is not what he is.
So one day, I know we're gonna, sometime before the summer's up, we're gonna be talking about J.K. Dobbins, but we're gonna save that one because I think that's gonna be a much longer discussion.
Sure.
But let's go to a couple of running backs and really, or let's go to Chicago and talk about that offense. That's probably a good way to start. And I want to start with a running back because one of my guys is Khalil Herbert. I've always thought that Khalil Herbert was a Dalvin Cook starter kit. Like, that's the way that you talk about him, because he has that curvilinear movement, but he also can be a hard cutting back. He's got that game breaking speed that you would look for. and he's a tough runner between the tackles who maybe is underutilized a little bit as a receiver because Montgomery was a decent receiver out of the backfield, and you didn't have really a great offense going on there in Chicago. And then, recently Pro Football Reference talked about how he broke a tackle, I think, once every 14 attempts, which was 11th highest in the NFL among qualifiers. And you start watching his game a little bit more in the pros, and you go, maybe he's no longer the starter kit, but he's like the Dalvin Cook knockoff that your friends who may not watch football as much as you might not see much of a difference between the two players, even though if you watch enough, you'll see, there's a little bit of a gap there, but it's not as great of a gap that you don't look and say, I understand why the Bears have him as their number one back, why Donta Foreman is a nice reserve who can get in there and do things if you need him to be, and why they're excited about Rashawn Johnson. But at the end of the day, why can't, Khalil Herbert be a 220, 230 attempt runner who gets you about 1,000 to 1,100 yards, and then maybe get some of those, instead of getting 9 to 15 receptions, he's getting between 20 to 35 receptions. And now you're looking at a top 20 running back in an offense that actually has more weapons now and some upgrades along the offensive line, hopefully. But what are your thoughts on Herbert along some of those things?
As a Bears fan, I love what he can do for that offense. My only issue with his future is the everything else. He is a fan. I think he's he's a top 10 pure runner in the NFL, in my opinion. I think every day of the week, right, what he can do in inside zone, how he reads second level engagements, how well he can read disengages and get by defenders, and he's a good accelerator. He does a lot of things really well as a runner, right? But it's as a receiver and more importantly, in pass protection.
Yeah.
That is where he really becomes a liability, and that is, I think, a big thing with Justin Fields being at the helm, is they're going to want to protect their investment with Fields. And that's why I think they brought in Rashawn Johnson, because that was David Montgomery's role largely. He was the bodyguard of that offense, right? Kind of the energy giver too, and that's not who Khalil Herbert is. And he also has trouble as a receiver, right? He's not a great lateral mover, and on some of those option patterns and things like that, angle patterns, that's not going to be him, right? He's going to be more of the of a check down type guy. Think of when Miles Sanders had that big receiving season.
Screens, wide routes.
Bingo, exactly, right? Things outside the numbers, more check downs, but that's not who Justin Fields is as a passer.
True.
And also too, what I worry about with a guy like Herbert is Herbert should be a 12 to 15 touchdown guy every single freaking year, but his quarterback's going to vulture 10 of those. and that is going to be the issue, which is a good, as a Bears fan, I love it, but as someone who has Khalil Herbert in a number of places, fantasy-wise, I'm like, oh, God, there's going to be so many drives where it's going to be down to the 2, and you're going to see, zone read, and Fields going to take it in.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that kind of sucks, is it's kind of like J.K. Dobbins a bit in Baltimore. J.K. Dobbins is never going to reach his ceiling in fantasy because of 2 reasons. A, Lamar Jackson is one of the best runners in the NFL.
Right. Okay?
So he's going to steal and siphon some of those touchdowns. And B, Lamar Jackson doesn't check down.
Yeah.
Justin Fields doesn't check down.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the issue, is to develop in something, you have to actually do it, right? And that's going to be the thing with Herbert as a receiver. We see this kind of question mark. He's not going to get better at receiver because he's not going to get the opportunity very much. And that's my worry, is if a passer like Justin Fields, instead of taking off and running, is going to check down to a guy like Herbert. It's going to be tough, but I love Herbert. But I think it's going to be hard for me to see a guy like him get 12 touchdowns like he should, which is tough because I haven't a ton of places. I think he's a hell of a runner, but Justin Fields going to siphon a ton of those.
Yeah, I mean, that's astute. It's astute thinking and analysis when you're talking about the player. Now, I want to look up how many touchdowns did Montgomery have last year? Just out of curiosity. Let's go.
It was really interesting too. If you looked at how they utilized him, it was a finish the drive type. right?
Yeah.
And that's how they played him, right? It was like every like third or second series, like Herbert would come in and he would take it, and he'd finish the drive.
Yeah.
So that's gonna be interesting too. Is like, he played 13 games. The thing is too, like he had six. He almost had 6 yards of carry, right? I mean, this is. He's going to be the leading rusher on that offense, in my opinion. But it's going to be the question of the touchdowns.
Yeah, and when you look at it, here's the other, and say your argument doesn't hold water this year in terms of like Fields siphoning those touchdowns. Now he already did. Like if we look last year, David Montgomery had 5 touchdowns, only 5 touchdowns to lead back, and Justin Fields had 8. Okay,
right.
But if you combine Montgomery and Herbert, you get 9 touchdowns there. But it's still but you're left thinking, like, how many could they have had? And then you add in the fact that who's going to be that guy that is going to also come in and start munching on part of that pie that you don't want, and that's probably Foreman or Johnson.
Foreman initially, then I think Roschon Johnson, and that begs the question too. How many touchdowns is David Montgomery going to have this year?
Yes. And there are a lot of people who are sitting there going, but Montgomery just wasn't a great touchdown scorer. But when you look at the line and you look at Fields and you look at all those things, now you look at this and you go, well, I love Jamal Williams as a player, an all-around player. But, yeah, Montgomery can be plugged into that role. And
he's a better player than Jamal Williams is, in my opinion.
Yes, I would agree. And that's a really nice look there. Montgomery's a guy that I think people are sleeping on, even from that standpoint, because he has really multiple ways to get production, even if he's not the sole number one guy.
No, 100%. He's at 1,000. He's at 1,000 total yards in every season.
Yeah,
and and he's never had when was the last time David Montgomery had a top 30 offensive line? Right. So it's like,
maybe at his district in high school.
I know, right? I mean, geez. I mean, you go back to Iowa State, and the Cyclones were terrible too, and from an offensive line standpoint. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing too is Montgomery goes to a place where he's top 8 offensive line, right? Yeah. I think double-digit touchdowns are well within the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
But I think Khalil Herbert, too, I think the offensive line has gotten better in Chicago. Hasn't gotten worse, but the issue, again, is it's not the offensive line in terms of scoring touchdowns. It's going to be how many is Justin Fields in a siphon.
Yeah.
And it's going to be 8 to 12 every single freaking year.
All right. So tell me, DJ Moore, is he finally going to get to be the man who can be like, can he be, he's flirted with being a top 15 fantasy player for sure.
Yeah.
He's had that. Can that be the trend with him for the rest of his time that he's under contract in Chicago?
Yeah, I don't think he has a choice either. I mean, and that's that might be the Bears fan in me coming out, but I mean, it's not Chase Claypool.
No.
Right?
No.
It's not Darnell Mooney, who I love. I think he's a great secondary piece in the NFL offense, but that's how it has to be.
Yeah.
It's not Cole Kmet.
No.
Right? And that's it. That is your supporting cast for Justin Fields.
Yeah.
It is DJ Moore and Darnell Mooney, and that's it. Yeah. Chase Claypool is
Yeah.
I'm no thank you. But yeah, I think DJ Moore has to be. He's gonna get it. He's gonna get over 125, 135 targets.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And he's gonna fit in multiple ways that they will use play action to get offense out of him, whether it's crossing the middle of the field, quick slants, crossing routes, or the deep ball. He's gotten better as a vertical route runner and contested catch player.
Yeah, and I think too, when I look at a guy like DJ Moore, he's gotten better at making late adjustments to the ball.
Yes.
And I think that is where, when I looked at him in Carolina, that's where I'm like, you know what? This is going to be a better NFL player than he is in college. because that part of his game is developing. And that's going to be something too where Justin Fields is going to need that. He needs the guy.
Yeah.
Right. I think you're going to look at a guy like Moore being on the field 100% of the time, and I think he's going to give you big plays. He's going to give you, the important down and distances. He's going to give you the wide receiver one production, because that is why they traded for him.
The best thing that I saw Moore do at Carolina that really he stood out was when everyone was talking about Curtis Samuel, and you watched them both run dig routes. Moore's dig routes were there. Moore. I mean, I like Curtis Samuel, and I'm glad to see that he stayed healthy last year, and that maybe there's more to come. That he's figured out a little bit of. They say that he's figured out, or the team has helped him figure out what he needs to do maintenance wise to his body to stay on the field, and hopefully that can continue.
Sure.
But with Moore, you could see flatter breaks, and he's a more physical guy. And so when you can have the physical guy who can also win after the catch like Moore, he scares the tar out of defenders in the middle of the field in ways that Claypool does not, or Kmet, because Kmet's the, how do I put this? Because Kmet's obviously a good NFL tight end. Like he's and you say a guy who can start for your team. But Kmet's the mistake that I think scouts and GMs make every year when they scout a guy, because they're looking for someone who can do everything well enough as opposed to someone who's special in one area. Like the Belichick approach with tight ends is like, I don't worry about the blocker. I can get those in the late rounds.
Let's just throw the darts and see if
let's 100%. Get the special guy who can be the receiver, and if he happens to block well, that's great too. But we want something that stands out, and I don't think Kmet's ever going to be that. That's why Tunyon's there, in a respect as can he get back to that form where we can detach him and do a little bit more with him as a detached option, because also he's our hedge for Claypool, who hasn't really shown anything.
Don't get me started with that. With that trade was
yeah. Listen, when my buddies at Keeping It 100, we got to have you on as a guest with them. You guys can commiserate together with the Bears podcast, because
that was terrible.
Yeah, and it's just, we've talked about I've talked about this a lot on shows in the past, is that Claypool's just that guy who his first 6 games of his rookie career, they had Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson, and one other player I'm trying to remember who was in that lineup, who basically the opposing defenses those first 6 to 7 games was rolling to everybody else but Claypool, and then they underestimated Claypool being able to win tight at the boundary, in terms of him being tight to the boundary, not the defender being tight to him to the boundary. But once they fixed all that and said we got to make him the priority, his game tanked.
And he's not and that's the thing is, he's one of those, he looks the part, right? 6'4", 230 plus,
quick twitch.
Yeah, right? But he's the guy at the rec center that looks like he played, college basketball, but he can't make an open jumper.
He's the anti-Heinz
Ward,
basically.
Yes. No, 100%. I'm not a fan of him whatsoever. And he's going to forever be an ancillary piece to. He'll have a couple games where he has, 3 for 120 and 2 or something. Right. He gets a couple big ones against a bad defense.
Yeah.
But he's not going to be a secondary option in that offense. And he's someone I might firmly do not draft this 100%.
So let's end this with a guy that I'm wondering how intriguing you find him, and also because of all the injuries and that have been talked about with him, and that's Tyjae Spears. Are you, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Is, certainly you watch him at Tulane, and whether it's LaShawn McCoy or Jamal Charles, those are guys that kind of come to mind to various people when you see some of his runs. He's a massive playmaker. You like the speed, you like the quickness, the ability to transition from a sideline approach to a downhill approach is amazing. He didn't
Mhm.
get a lot of receptions, but the receptions that he did, targets he did get, make your eyes pop out of your head and go, "Oh, you mean they match him up one on one in the overtime
Mhm.
against a quarterback detached and throw fade routes to him, and he wins them? I mean, that's the kind of guy that
Yeah.
you've got." So here he is behind Derrick Henry, and probably only behind Derrick Henry, considering that Hassan Haskins is, not really that great of a mover, kind of a nice gap runner who recently had some off-field trouble. Um, and you're looking at all of this, and that sounds great, but then everybody's freaked out about, oh, he had an ACL tear, and there's thickening with the cartilage, and he's doesn't have an ACL in that, and so as a guy who's certainly been around a lot of high end athletes and been a high end athlete yourself and has
Sure.
works and trains with people, I think of Hines Ward, who didn't have two ACLs even by the time he got to Georgia, and he was recruited as a running back. And I remember watching him as a running back.
Right.
Or John Elway didn't have an ACL, and played a long time. And some NBA players who didn't.
Mm-hmm.
People talk about and then Brian Westbrook and Frank Gore. Frank Gore played forever, and he had both ACLs torn, and Brian Westbrook had both ACLs torn. Both of them did before they ever made it to the NFL. There's a thing
Right.
called Copers, right? So I want you to talk about these phenomenons and what you think about Copers and what you think about maybe his specific injuries.
I think really the biggest thing is, like, first, we don't know, right? We don't know how he's doing currently. All we know is they drafted him in the first 4 rounds.
Yeah.
Okay. And we do know that their offensive line has improved. And we also know that Ron Carthon was actively trying to deal Derrick Henry. This might be the end of the road for Derrick Henry as a Tennessee Titan, which means I do think the Tennessee Titans try one more year. I think they do get DeAndre Hopkins. They go all in one more year. But what that means is for that offense to fire on all cylinders come January and February, they need to lessen the load on Derrick Henry. They absolutely need to. And they found out last year when they needed Derrick Henry, it's not going to be pretty come December, January, right? You need to keep a guy like that healthy because if they want to win the playoffs, Derrick Henry has to be 100% Derrick Henry. So I think Tyjae Spears, from the perspective of can he stay healthy? Absolutely. I've seen, worked with, known athletes who have everything wrong with them known to man, and be phenomenal athletes for their career and not have problems. But I've also seen the opposite. I've seen athletes who never get hurt in college end up getting hurt every single year, like Trey Lance. Who would have thought this would have been the outcome of his career, right? This is a guy who wasn't really hurt in college, who no one ever saw this coming.
And physical.
Yeah, exactly. And then now it's boom. He's the injury bugs got him, and that's going to be potentially the end of a what if career for him, right? And so it happens all the time, and injuries are part of the sport. They're part of the game. But the best predictor of injury is previous injury. So is Tyjae Spears likely to suffer lower limb injuries the rest of his career? The answer is absolutely yes. However, is he more likely than somebody else?
It's only 5% more likely.
Exactly. Not very much because of the nature of
Yeah.
the position,
Yeah.
right? That's the thing is, the position he plays is one of the most violent positions in the sport.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, I think it's looking at, hey, is this going to be a guy that can get a future job as a Tennessee Titan? The answer is absolutely yes. If I was to have a betting favorite as to who is the starting running back for the Tennessee Titans at this time next year, it is Tyjae Spears.
Yeah, and guys who move like he did last year, coming off of what he did and played all year, I don't know. I mean, to me,
Yeah, he's a dude. He's a. I mean, in terms of open space players in this class, he is in the top 3.
Yeah, him and Nate Dell, class. Right? Like him and Nate Dell.
Yeah, exactly. Him and yeah, Tank Dell is. Yeah, I mean, those are the guys where ball's in their hands in space, and there's 0% chance you win.
Yeah,
and 100%.
And they're saying, from what I've read a little bit this spring, is that he's showing that right now, at least in the ways that you can see it.
And they haven't had that. They haven't had that piece of their offense, right? They've never had a guy who could legitimately be the 1B to Derrick Henry's 1A.
Yeah.
They haven't had that guy. They've had guys who are, nice secondary, ancillary pieces, but not guys you want to give, 10-plus touches to, right? Because you're taking away from the king.
Yeah.
But I think now they're gonna have a young guy in Tyjae Spears who not only as a runner, but as a receiver, right? They need weapons, right, in the passing game, and Tyjae Spears can provide that, which is something that Derrick Henry can't really do.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a piece for him to fight for third downs and be on the field more often as the year kind of progresses. And I think he's going to be a key part to them being a playoff team, because I think, honestly, a guy like Derrick Henry, you need to limit his snaps during the season in some capacity, because if you want to get to, like I said, January and February with this Tennessee Titans football team, because if they make a run at DeAndre Hopkins, it tells you one thing. They're making one last go of this thing before Ron Gartham blows it up, throws the grenade. And I think that's going to signal for, okay, this is going to be time to take some tread off Henry's tires, make sure he's ready when it counts. And I think that means they're going to get a nice long look at Tyjae Spears being the feature back potentially in that offense in years to come. So I'm excited to see what that looks like, because he's a immensely talented player.
Well, listen, I can tell you that we're going to help you guys get there when it counts, with the 1-2 punch that we've got going on here on this podcast. It's been a lot of fun. And, I laugh because my last thought is, now that you talk about you've worked with players who look like everything's going wrong with them, but they still have like long careers, it kind of sounds like the idea of like a bumblebee that but they shouldn't fly based on physics, but they somehow do. So I now I'm gonna think of when I see Tyjae Spears running, I'm gonna think of a bee.
Sure, 100%. Hey, buzzing in the end zone, man.
Yeah, but yeah, listen, of course you can find Angelo Analysis at angeloanalysis.com. Definitely check out his work and the subscription offerings that he has. You can find him on Twitter at Angelo_fantasy. You can find me at Matt Waldman or at MattWaldmanRSP.com. You can find the rookie scouting portfolio with the projections and the pre-draft, post-draft guide. They're available on the site, and where you can figure out how to get them. And appreciate that you guys listening in. Appreciate Brandon for joining me this year. This has been we've only done 2 officially, and it's everything that I hoped it would be and more. So
likewise, 100%.
Yeah. So we will see you guys probably early August. That's probably where that's gonna go. He's got some work related stuff where he's got to actually deal with actual athletes, and I've got a couple weeks of tape watching that I've got to do. So we will catch you in August, and thanks again, and have a good night.